everybody. Welcome to Shop Talks. It's a presentation of the Ink Kitchen and Impressions who put the show on. And we have sponsors, Los Angeles Apparel and Alpha Broder being the main ones. Also Lane 7 Stalls, Transfer Express, and SPSI. Got with me Danny Gruninger from Daybirds Printing in Denver, Colorado. We're going to talk about something near and dear to me, which is setup. To me, we just had to talk about sales. Your business will not do well without sales and without quickly setting up. And so we're going to talk about setup. I'll give a little background. Danny and I go back a ways. We used to fight on Facebook. That was our initial thing. Got a lot of respect for him, though. He always knew what he was talking about. And so I'm super happy to have him up here, and a topic like the most dear to me probably at this show. So let's just start with the obvious one. So to get a lot of shirts done in the day, it matters how fast your press goes, right? How fast it cycles. Is that it at the end of the week?
I mean, that's what you want to think, right? But we all know, shop owners, the people that are out there, the only time we make money is when the press is actually spinning. And when you go into shops, at least the shops that I've gone into, the most downtime is between jobs. Most printers or shops are pretty good at getting a job and printing it once it's set up, but to get to that point, that's the most difficult part. So, my focus when I came into the industry was really how fast can I change over jobs, how many jobs can I get done in a day, and how can I keep my press spinning. So that's really what I kind of focused on, and why I went down the rabbit hole of trying to get perfect registration, all the time.
All right, so I agree 100%. I used to say, a lot of screen printers were crappy students. I was like, when you get a D, you can still pass. You get a couple zeros, you're not going to pass. Might as well give up. And when you're printing no shirts, the average print per hour is 0, and it brings your average down pretty damn fast. So unless you're printing hundreds of thousands of shirts at the same time, which we all wish for and doesn't happen that often, it's all about setup. So I want to talk about maybe process and the equipment and what goes into. You don't just drink a lot of coffee and go fast. What goes into fast setup times?
Yeah, so I think before we get into process is a really big thing, but the process will not work if the tools aren't set up properly. So for me, there's really 4 tools that I look at in my shop that have to be dialed in to really maximize the setup. The first one, obviously, that's the press. The press has to be set up. The press has to be calibrated. And, not to get on any of these press guys, but if you really want it done right, after the tech leaves your shop, you've got to do a little bit more work than what they did. So for me, that meant putting dial indicators on my flood bars and squeegees and making sure that my pallets are exactly in parallel. That meant the print carriage is exactly in plane with the pallets. There's lots of things on the press that you want to calibrate to where, that's not the reason why you're not getting perfect registration. So the press is kind of the first tool that needs to be calibrated correctly. The second thing is either your PRU or your direct to screen. Your film output, how you're imaging your screens, that all has to be really dialed in too. For me, I run DTS in my shop. I've had, I think, 8 or 9 different DTS over the years. Everybody out there, they all make really good machines, but nobody really goes that extra step to match your machine with your press. So when you match your DTS with your press, that's going to get you a lot closer. So that's your next tool that you need to calibrate. Beyond that, the third one is your screens. If you don't have good screens, this is screen printing for a reason. In my shop, all of the screens are within 2 newtons. If they're outside of a 3 to 4, 5 newton range, you're going to struggle with registration on your press. So having a screen that is matched from screen to screen, if you're going to print a 10-color job, every screen should be within 2 newtons. So that's the third thing. And then the next thing is squeegees. Squeegees aren't as important, but Again, if you don't have a good blade, you're going to struggle with some registration at times. So for me, it's making sure the tools are all properly set up. Your press, your PRU, your DTS, your screens, and then your blades. If you have all that dialed in, then you can start to work on processes.
I agree 100%. Maybe come down a little higher on the squeegees. Probably because it seems like a lot of people don't think about it. I've been in shops that actually had the squeegees that the press was sold to them like 3 years earlier, and that's it. Like never thought about it again, never thought that's a disaster actually. And then if you're trying to save money on squeegee rubber, God help you, you're a fool. You are a fool. Sorry, some of you might be fools, but it's not a place to save money, I'll tell you. It is not a place to save money.
No, I mean, I think your screens, your squeegees, if you want good setups and good registration, it starts there. I mean, if you're using, really janky wood screens or, one screen that's 10 Newton and one that's 30 Newtons, you're never going to have success on press.
Right. I would also add that, and maybe you would, how you get to those screens, whether it's rigid or Newmans, whether you have your own stretcher or whatever, they just have to be good, right? You can make things work, but you better make them work. I noticed a lot of people that used to have Newmans say, oh no, I'm all rigid. And then you go there and they like run their screens until they rip, which is not necessarily a good idea. They don't have a stretcher and they don't send them back. I'm like, what do you do? Like, that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for, I've been on both sides of it. I was a big Newman guy for a lot of years. I love Newman roller frames. I think it's the cream of the crop in terms of a screen printing frame. For me now, I run statics, but I hold my screen guy accountable for what he ships me. So when I order frames, I tell them it needs to be within this spec. If it's not within that spec, they don't ship it to me, because I know when it gets to my shop, it's not going to work if they send me a 20 Newton screen, that's not going to work in my shop for the type of work that I do.
All right, so your equipment's dialed in. I want to talk a little bit about the process that goes in both ahead of time and actually at the press to make sure that you can set up quickly.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that still to this day a lot of shops overlook is the shop management software. So if you don't have software or some sort of internal system that's speccing out your jobs, and having somebody in your facility that's really good of making sure that when a job gets to the press, it's set up for success. It's not you're printing a white and then you're not flashing it, you're stepping on it, you're doing all this other stuff. Having somebody that can engineer the print before it gets to the press and then put that in that software, that's a big thing in terms of getting registration even better and getting jobs set up faster. So really just queuing everything up and being one step ahead. In our shop, we used to be 100% water-based, my last facility. So we could not pre-ink screens before they got to press. Now that we primarily run plastisol, and our pre-press is dialed in, our DTS, our registration's pretty dialed in, there's no reason why we shouldn't pre-ink screens going to the press. So that's one thing that really helps our setup times is our press operator does not have to load ink on the screen. The ink is already on the screen when it goes to the press. So I think if you can start thinking of things like that where the press operator's not doing as many steps, they're just setting up, and maybe, it's like when you stage the job before it gets to the press. You have your job cart, you have your screens on it, your inks are already on your screens, your squeegee and flub bar are already on your screens. Everything is ready to go. The screens are clearly marked in this order. That way the operator knows exactly how to put those in. They don't have to think about it. They just go up there and do it. That will make it to where you set up much, much faster.
And then the other part, of course, of turning jobs over is what you do after the job is completed. So want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think depending on the size of your facility, I've always had the mindset that I don't want my operators that are running the press to actually be doing that tear down, that dirty work. They're kind of like the race car driver to me. Like that press, that's the race car, and the person that's running that's the driver. You don't see those race car drivers go back to their pit and start tearing their car apart, working on it. You know, they're focused on their next race, which really that's how the mentality of the press operator should be. So depending on the size of your shop, I suggest having the crew takes the job down and the press operator immediately focuses on the next job. They don't go clean up, they don't go clean squeegees or flood bars. You need to have at least, I like to have at least 4 times the amount of screens and tools in my shop than I'm going to use for that day. So if I'm going to go through, say, 20 screens a day, 20 squeegees, 20 flood bars, I want to have at least 4 times that amount in my facility. That way we can always keep it staged up and ready to go.
So after they finish, they just take a break, right? That's a good time to take a break?
I mean, you know,
it's a natural human thing to do, and I think you want to talk about the mentality, that's the pit crew mentality maybe.
I mean, I think, you know, for the press operator, when they're done printing a job, say they printed 1,000 shirts, they're pretty gutted, right? I mean, it's not an easy job to sit at a press crushing shirts for, you know, an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours. So I always like to have somebody that oversees the setup and the teardown. When that person leaves the press, that press operator, they get done, they can go take a 5-minute break because I've got another 1 or 2 people coming in behind them, tearing down and then setting up that next job. So really, that press operator does need some breaks. You can't expect somebody to sit at a press and just print all day long. So I like to have that crew that comes in, that tears down, sets up somewhat separately, and that press operator is kind of the race car driver.
How about adhesives? Pallet adhesives.
Adhesives?
Yeah. What do you do to keep things going, but not screw up your shop?
So, you know, as you get familiar with water-based pallet adhesive, you learn how to use it in between pulling shirts off and putting them on. A lot of shops use spray tacks when the press is running. I've figured out a way to get around that. You just have to have an extra person. I like to use a ketchup bottle with a 3-prong tip on it. You get a little bit more coverage on the pallet, and you can cart it on a lot quicker in between pulling a shirt off and putting a shirt on. So for me personally, I'm a big proponent of water-based pallet glue. I hate spray tacks. I try to never use it. I recommend to everybody out there, don't use spray tacks.
You do have to think of the long term, and your good press operators are going to quit if you use spray tack, honestly. Same reason why I air condition my shop. Everybody would quit on the hottest days. Anything else you want to say, or shall we open it up to questions?
I mean, I think the big thing is you always got to go just a little bit further than, you know, what's given to you. If a manufacturer comes in and installs your press, your DTS, you can't expect it to be 100%. You can't expect to get perfect setups. You got to go a little bit further on your own to figure out what works in your shop. So that's my advice for that. You know, try to build processes around keeping your press spinning. You know, pre-inking screens, that's a big one if you're running plastisol. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Actually, one thing you touched on, you know, about tuning up your press. How about telling people what things to think about when they're buying a press, in that it will make it easier to set up? You know, certain things, you know, about the pallets being level or whatever. What are the concerns on a press? What has to be right to set up quickly?
I mean, really just, you know, having level and plain pallets, having the print carriage in line. I'm a big proponent, you know, most of the new presses you see these days, the carousel does not lift up and down. That extra movement of the carousel going up and down, it's harder for the operator to load shirts, and then also it's harder with registration. So I think if you're looking to buy a new press these days, I mean, you know, all these guys make good presses. You know, it's just a matter of finding what works for you, and then, you know, kind of fine-tuning it from there.
Make sure it fits in your process. That's it. You mentioned. All right, let's open it up to questions about setup. Someone here knows everything, so they're not asking any questions. Who has questions about setup?
During the setup process, when a job is just not quite right when you're running test prints, whether it's separation or ink colors, at what point do you call it quits and just tear that job out and move on?
The question was, if you've got a print, you're trying to set it up and it's not going right, at what point do you pull the plug and move on to something else?
You know, I think that's specific to your shop. So my last facility, 5 autos, we had, crazy deadlines. The clients were calling every single day saying, like, we need our stuff, we need our stuff, we need our stuff. My current shop now is much more laid back. If I have a job up on the press, I could call my client and say, hey, I need extra time. So I think it depends on your shop. For me, it would be a little bit more dependent on if it's a separation issue, is it an ink issue? If it's an ink issue, going and making a new ink, that doesn't take a lot of time. So I'll leave it up on the press, and we'll go through that. If we need to reshoot a screen, if we need to reshoot maybe 2 or 3 screens, I'll tear the whole thing down and move on. If your press isn't spinning, you're not making any money. So my suggestion is, if you get to a point where you got to go back on artwork or you got to mix a ton of inks, take it down and move on.
It does depend on your facility. Like, certain presses set up really quickly also, I would say, in terms of registration. So like you said, if we have screens that are wrong, we would take it down probably. And same with ink, like we would keep going. If it's an art issue, the temptation is to do some screwball thing sometimes, and I think you should avoid that. I mean, maybe it's a small job that you can just do something wacky and get through it, but usually you want to get it right for good, and it's better to fix it on the art end. You want to print all the time the same way. You don't want to do crazy exposures. You don't want to do crazy stuff on press. You really want to print the same way all the time as much as possible with as little variable, I don't know if you agree, but as few variables as possible, and change things on the art end if they're not going right.
No, I would agree 100%. I think it goes back to, that position in the shop that kind of tees up the jobs. If that job is teed up correctly before it gets to the press, the print order's correct, the flashes are in the right spots, the ink is blending a certain way, red is going on top of yellow versus yellow on top of red. If you start thinking about all those things before it gets to the press, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. So I think just kind of teeing it up and making sure you think about it before it gets there, that's going to save you a lot of time.
Yeah, I don't think we touched on it, but in some ways you have to preview the jobs way in advance to make sure, do we have enough of that weird metallic ink that we don't use that often? Do we, your supplies have to be there to do anything that you want to do, and sometimes they're not. Does any job require something special? Larger pallets or something like that. Especially with bags, are they going to fit on your machine right? You can't tell from the measurements sometimes because the way they slip on the arm. Are they going to fit right? You got to test that. You can have another question.
In addition to that, how heavy do you weigh on consolidating similar jobs? Say you have multiple jumbo jobs, maybe multiple youth pallet jobs. At what point do you try to group those up together, and at what point do you just call it the deadline date and just get them on press, move to the next job?
So the question is, how much do you group together youth jobs and stuff? We don't. Our pallets switch over super fast, less than 5 minutes. But we have MHM presses that do that. So, but if you had the others, I would.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on your equipment. There are pallets that are pretty cumbersome to get on and off presses. With the presses that we use, it's literally you push one button and the pallet unlocks, and it's super simple. You can do a complete changeover on a 14 pallet machine in under a minute. So for us, we don't really group jobs. If we're during that day or period of week, if we're running a big job and we might have a sleeve job come in, we might group it at that point, but typically we don't, just because the pallet changeovers are so fast.
We don't have a split belt on our dryer, so sometimes we do group things that require different belt speed. Other questions? Come on, Eric. You gotta stump us.
Yeah, when you're setting up jobs, as far as like the squeegees go, choosing which durometer you're going to use, and then also do you try to standardize your angles and then your pressures? I mean, what are the different variables that you try to stay within?
So the question is about what choice of squeegee, and then angles and pressures.
I know it's a lot. I'm just saying, do you try to standardize angles, or are you letting your guys switch them around from screen to screen depending on what the mesh is?
Yeah, for me in my shop, it's always been very standardized. We run between a 10 and 15 degree angle on pretty much everything. There are certain, maybe special effects or times where we need maybe a touch more ink to where we might lay the squeegee over a little bit more. But for the most part, in our shop, the squeegee angle does not change. Really, it's kind of going into that engineering it up front, and whoever's doing, if you're doing a lot of simulated process, whoever the separation artist is understanding how ink behaves on the press. But for me, shearing the ink has been, a 10 degree angle shears the ink very well if you maintain the squeegee blade.
We're pretty much the same. For a while, we used to have a lot of different durometers. I think we have 3 now. 60, 70, I don't know, we have 3. 2 kinds of triple durometer and 1 little softer one, which we hardly use. And then we keep mostly the same angles, flood bar and squeegee. You don't want, there's so many freaking variables in screen printing. Reduce them as much as you can. Another question?
Okay, so you guys talk a lot about print engineering. What are the skills or sort of the knowledge that that print engineer or that person that's deciding what mesh count, what print order, what squeegee blades, who is deciding that, and how in depth are you trying to get so that when you get to press, you don't have these guessing games?
All right, so the question is about if you're pre-engineering things in terms of mesh, ink, etc., who does that and how do they do it? Some smart person in your shop. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is a struggle. I think everybody tries to find that person. I think it's tough. I think a lot of time it's got to come out of your own shop. Every shop's a little bit different, and all the shops that I've been into, if you can cultivate somebody from your own culture, that's definitely better than bringing in somebody else.
I agree. And the only other thing I would say is, and you touched on it a little, don't have that person doing something else that they don't need to be doing. You know what I mean? If you need that person to do that, don't have them loading. They need to be looking at those jobs. They're going to be way more valuable. It's really, I'll point out the difficulty. I went in a shop that runs 24 hours in Chicago. I think they have 10 machines. They have 1 person only. When he's on vacation even, he does a lot of that work. Like, it's really, really hard, important work. If you own your business, you might be doing that because it's super important and most people cannot do it. Other questions?
Just on the squeegees again.
You don't ask questions. We're coming to your shop and we're going to see how fast you set up. And you're going to be embarrassed.
Do you advocate squeegee sharpening or changing them out?
We can't hear you.
Do you advocate squeegee sharpening or do you just change them out?
That's a good one. Do you advocate squeegee sharpening?
In an ideal world, if I could put a new blade on a squeegee every job, I would. I can't do that, so yes, I do have a squeegee sharpener. To me, it's huge. I like to take a squeegee and rub it across my finger, and I'd be able to hear, like the scales on my finger. That's how sharp I like my squeegees. So I
killed a man with a squeegee once.
Yeah. So I'm a huge proponent of it. I think, one of my mentors, Andy Anderson, I think before he would set up a job, he would sharpen his squeegees, every job. So I think, for depending on the type of work that you do, if you do a lot of process work, fine detail work, I'd have a sharp blade all the time. If you're doing a lot of spot color work where it's not as critical, it's not huge, but again, you see guys that have 3, 4, 5-year-old presses that are still running this OEM blade, and it's like, what are you guys doing?
So I was against it until I went to Andy Anderson's shop as well, because he certainly knew what he was doing. Got to say something though. You can only sharpen it so much because as it gets shorter, it effectively changes the durometer of the squeegee. And you also have to have a really good squeegee sharpener and someone that knows how to do it well, or you will make things worse. So I will say that we change ours a lot. I see my supplier over there. It's like, yeah, that's a good one. Buy new ones. You can't. The best printer I've had work for me, he said that he can print with anything except not bad squeegees. That's the one thing he can't do. So it is really, really important whether you change them or sharpen them. If you do sharpen them, there's different kinds, the slicing kind and the rotating kind. Some of the rotating kind can, with the heat, effectively change the squeegee as well, and you got to watch that. Oh, don't soak your squeegees to clean them. There's a little advice. You're talking about squeegees.
And don't leave ink on them.
It'll absorb in and change the durometer as well. And it's lazy, which is a bad thing to do. Other questions about setting up quickly?
Would you leave white ink on your white squeegee?
Do I?
Or
No.
No?
No, never.
Maybe until we print the next job 5 minutes later, but no. Clean it off.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going from, if we have a white underbase and we tear that job down and our next job going up has a white underbase, we leave those tools in the press. It's much faster. Obviously, if we're going to a different white ink, that squeegee and flood bar will come out.
Other questions about setup? What's the best way have you found to stage things?
On a cart.
You want to explain what that is for people that are beginnings? How does that look?
Yeah, so, it kind of goes back to having that shop management software. Somebody schedules your, production queue for that day. Before that day happens, the day prior or maybe 2 days prior, the production manager or, the mover that we call it in some shops, they're kind of teeing up all these job carts for the next day or the day after. So they've got ink, squeegees, flood bars, screens, job ticket that has all the info for the job all ready to go. So those carts just get staged up in a staging area in the order that they need to get completed.
Thanks. Other questions? All right. Well, how about a hand for Danny Gruninger? Want to thank our sponsors, Impressions, InKitchen.com, Los Angeles Apparel, Alpha Broder. Thank you for coming. We'll be around if you want to ask questions. I think, Danny not only has a shop, but been in a lot of shops, and you have a rare opportunity to ask someone questions. I recommend you take advantage of it. All right, thanks for coming.